Sarah Martinez stood barely 5 feet tall in her worn cowboy boots, watching another potential employer's eyes drift past her to scan the crowd behind. The man's disappointed expression told her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Look, miss, I appreciate you coming out, but I was expecting someone more substantial," he said, adjusting his hat awkwardly. "The work's hard, and my boys need someone who can handle herself around the ranch." "Maybe try the diner in town?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I can work harder than any man you've got, sir. Give me a chance to prove it." The rancher shook his head and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone beside the job posting board outside Murphy's General Store. She'd driven 3 hours from El Paso for this interview, burning gas money she couldn't afford to lose. This was the 5th rejection in 2 weeks, and each one stung worse than the last. At 26, Sarah had been working ranches since she was 16, but her diminutive size always worked against her. People saw her delicate features and assumed she was fragile, never bothering to notice the calluses on her hands or the strength in her compact frame. Her late father had taught her everything about cattle, horses, and ranch management before cancer took him when she was 21. Her mother had remarried and moved to Phoenix, leaving Sarah to fend for herself. The savings from selling her childhood home had finally run out last month. Her apartment in El Paso was decent, but the rent kept climbing, and her part-time job at the feed store barely covered groceries. She needed steady work, the kind that paid enough to build something for herself. Sarah pulled the crumpled newspaper clipping from her jacket pocket and read it again. Bride for hire services. Temporary arrangements for social functions, family gatherings, business events. Professional, discreet, well compensated. Contact Helena Ashworth, Dallas. She'd torn the ad from a Dallas newspaper she'd found at a truck stop, thinking it might be her answer to quick money. The concept seemed straightforward enough. Wealthy men needed dates for important events, and women like her needed income. Helena Ashworth ran what she called a companion service for the upper class, promising legitimate arrangements with no impropriety. Sarah had called 3 times before finally working up the courage to drive to Dallas for an interview. Helena was an elegant woman in her 50s who ran her business from a tasteful office downtown. She'd been honest about the work, accompanying men to charity galas, business dinners, family weddings. Some clients needed arm candy, others wanted someone who could hold intelligent conversation with business partners. "The pay is excellent," Helena had explained, "but I only work with women who can adapt to any situation. My clients are successful men who demand excellence in everything, including their companions." "Can you handle that pressure?" Sarah had convinced herself she could, signing Helena's contract and agreeing to be available within 48 hours' notice. But 3 months later, she'd only been booked twice. Both times, clients had requested someone taller, more glamorous, more impressive. Helena's other women were mostly models and actresses, stunning creatures who commanded attention the moment they walked into a room. "You're lovely, Sarah, but you're not what most clients picture when they think escort," Helena had said gently during their last meeting. "Perhaps you should consider other options." Standing outside Murphy's store in the Texas heat, Sarah realized both her backup plans had failed spectacularly. She was too small for ranch work and too ordinary for companion services. Her truck's gas tank was nearly empty, and she had maybe $40 in her checking account. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A massive horse and rider were coming down the main street, drawing stares from everyone on the sidewalk. The horse was a beautiful paint stallion, probably 17 hands high, but it was the rider who commanded attention. The man had to be at least 6'5", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His black cowboy hat was pulled low over his face, but Sarah could see strong jawline covered by dark stubble. He wore a faded blue work shirt that strained across his chest and arms, and leather chaps that had seen years of honest use. Everything about him screamed authentic cowboy, from his worn boots to the way he sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. He guided the paint to a stop directly in front of the general store and dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. When he tied the reins to the hitching post, Sarah noticed his hands were huge, scarred from hard work, with long fingers that handled the leather with gentle precision. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat politely as he passed her on the wooden sidewalk. His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that made Sarah's stomach flutter unexpectedly. She managed a small nod in response, suddenly very aware of how dusty and defeated she must look. Inside the store, she could hear him talking to Murphy about feed prices and cattle futures. His voice carried easily through the thin walls, confident and knowledgeable. This wasn't some weekend cowboy or dude ranch tourist. This man knew his business. Sarah was still standing by the job board when he came back outside, carrying a heavy sack of grain over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He loaded it into the back of a battered pickup truck parked behind the store, then returned to untie his horse. "You looking for work?" he asked suddenly, glancing at the job board. Sarah startled, not realizing he'd noticed her. "Yes, sir. Ranch work." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her small stature and work clothes. Sarah braced herself for another dismissal, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than dismissive. "You have experience?" "Born and raised on a cattle ranch outside Amarillo. Been working stock since I could walk. My daddy taught me everything before he passed." Sarah lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I know I don't look like much, but I'm stronger than I appear, and I work harder than most men." Something shifted in his dark eyes, not pity, but something that might have been recognition. "What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez." "I'm Jake Coleman. I run the Broken Arrow Ranch, about 20 miles north of here." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "I might have something. Pays fair, and there's a cabin on the property if you need housing." Sarah's heart leaped, but she kept her expression neutral. Too many promising conversations had ended in disappointment. "What kind of work?" "I've got 300 head of cattle, 30 horses, and about 5,000 acres to manage. Just me and one other hand right now, and Pedro's getting ready to retire. Need someone who can handle horses, work cattle, fix fence, and isn't afraid of long days in the saddle." "I can do all of that," Sarah said immediately. "When do you want me to start?" Jake smiled for the first time, transforming his serious features. "Easy there. I haven't hired you yet. You got references?" Sarah's heart sank slightly. Most of her work had been for family friends or small operations that had since folded. "My last boss, Tom Hendricks, sold his ranch 2 years ago and moved to Florida. I can give you his number, but he might be hard to reach." "What about family? Someone who can vouch for your character?" "My mother remarried and moved to Phoenix. We don't talk much anymore." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Look, Mr. Coleman, I know how this sounds. No steady references, no family backing. But I'm not asking for charity. Give me a week to prove myself. If I can't do the job, I'll leave with no hard feelings." Jake studied her face intently, as if he could read her entire history there. Sarah forced herself to stand straight and meet his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away from those penetrating dark eyes. "You ever work alone with men before?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir. Never had any trouble. This isn't just day work. If you take the cabin, you'd be living on the ranch. Pedro's got his own place in town, so most nights it would just be you and me on the property. Some folks might have opinions about that arrangement." Sarah felt her cheeks burn hotter. She hadn't considered that aspect, but she needed this job too badly to let propriety stand in her way. "I can handle gossip, Mr. Coleman. And I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can." Jake untied his horse and swung into the saddle with easy strength. "Tell you what, Miss Martinez. Meet me at the Broken Arrow tomorrow morning at 6. We'll see how you handle a day's work, and if it goes well, we'll talk terms." He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it down to her. "Follow the highway north 12 miles, then turn west on County Road 47. Can't miss the sign." Sarah clutched the card like a lifeline. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman. You won't regret this." "We'll see," Jake said, but his tone wasn't unkind. "Wear your oldest clothes and bring whatever gear you've got." And, Miss Martinez? Don't be late. I start early. He touched the brim of his hat again and rode away, leaving Sarah standing in the dust with her first real opportunity in months. She looked down at the business card, noting the simple design and quality cardstock. Even his business cards suggested a man who did things right. The drive back to El Paso gave her time to think. Jake Coleman was clearly successful. His horse, his truck, even his clothes spoke of someone who made good money and spent it wisely. The Broken Arrow Ranch had to be a substantial operation if he was running 300 head of cattle on 5,000 acres. More importantly, he'd been willing to give her a chance when everyone else had dismissed her outright. Sarah couldn't quite shake the feeling that he'd seen something in her that others missed, but she refused to read too much into one conversation. Tomorrow would tell the tale. That evening, Sarah spread her gear across her small apartment, checking every piece carefully. Her boots were worn but still sturdy, her chaps were patched but functional, and her saddle was a good one her father had bought her for her 18th birthday. She'd sold almost everything else over the past year, but she'd held onto her riding equipment no matter how tight money got. She went to bed early, setting 3 alarms to make sure she didn't oversleep. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah tried not to think about how much this opportunity meant to her. Hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed so many times, but she couldn't help imagining what it would be like to work for someone who might actually appreciate her skills. Jake Coleman's deep voice echoed in her memory, along with the way he'd looked at her, not dismissively, but thoughtfully, like he was seeing possibilities rather than limitations. Sarah had spent so long being overlooked that simple consideration felt almost overwhelming. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. She just had to prove she was worthy of the chance he was offering. Sarah woke before her first alarm, adrenaline already coursing through her veins. She dressed carefully in her best work clothes, braided her long dark hair tightly, and loaded her gear into her truck. The drive to the Broken Arrow would take about 40 minutes, but she planned to arrive early. First impressions mattered, especially when you were trying to overcome people's preconceptions. The sun was just beginning to paint the horizon pink when she turned onto County Road 47. The Broken Arrow's entrance was marked by an impressive wooden arch with the ranch name burned into the crossbeam. The driveway stretched for nearly a mile through rolling pasture land, giving Sarah her first real look at the operation. The property was even more impressive than she'd expected. Cattle dotted the hills in organized groups, the fencing was in excellent repair, and the pastures showed signs of careful rotation and management. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a well-run agricultural business. The main compound included a large barn, several outbuildings, and a modest but well-maintained ranch house. Sarah could see horses in the corral beside the barn, including the massive paint Jake had ridden yesterday. Her truck's engine seemed loud in the pre-dawn quiet as she parked beside a newer pickup truck near the barn. Jake emerged from the barn as she was unloading her saddle, already dressed for work and moving with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been up for hours. In the morning light, he looked even larger than she'd remembered, his dark hair visible beneath his hat and his shirt already showing sweat stains across the shoulders. "Morning, Miss Martinez," he called. "Right on time. That's a good sign." "Morning, Mr. Coleman." Sarah hefted her saddle, determined not to struggle with the weight in front of him. "Where would you like me to start?" Jake studied her gear approvingly, his gaze lingering on the quality of her saddle and the worn but well-maintained condition of her chaps. "First, let's see how you handle a horse. Pedro picked out a mount for you, she's in the 3rd stall." Sarah followed him into the barn, breathing in the familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses. The building was spacious and clean, with a dozen stalls running down each side and a wide aisle down the middle. Most of the stalls held horses, and Sarah could tell at a glance that these were working animals, not show stock. "This is Rosie," Jake said, stopping beside a compact sorrel mare with intelligent eyes. "She's got good manners, but she'll test you if you let her. Pedro uses her for cutting work mostly." Sarah approached the mare slowly, letting Rosie sniff her hand before running gentle fingers along the horse's neck. The mare's ears pricked forward with interest rather than suspicion, and Sarah felt some of her nervousness ease. Horses had always been easier for her to read than people. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, meaning it. "How old?" 8. Good bloodlines, but she's got some attitude. Sound like anyone you know? Sarah shot him a quick glance, wondering if that was a compliment or a warning. Jake's expression remained neutral, but she thought she caught a hint of amusement in his dark eyes. Saddling Rosie went smoothly, and Sarah was careful to check every strap and buckle twice. When she swung into the saddle, the mare shifted slightly, testing her rider's balance and confidence. Sarah settled deeper into her seat and gathered the reins with quiet authority. "Good," Jake said, mounting his paint stallion. "We'll start with a ride around the property so you can get a feel for the layout. Then, we'll see how you do with cattle work." The next 4 hours were the best Sarah had experienced in months. Jake led her across the ranch, explaining his operation and testing her knowledge with casual questions. She was able to answer most of them, and, when she didn't know something, she asked intelligent follow-up questions. The broken arrow was even more impressive up close. Jake had built a sustainable operation based on rotational grazing, selective breeding, and careful land management. His cattle were healthy and well cared for, his pasture showed proper stewardship, and his equipment was maintained to professional standards. "You run this whole operation with just one other hand?" Sarah asked as they stopped to check a water tank. "Pedro's been with me for 15 years. Good man, knows cattle better than anyone I've met. But he's 68 now, and the work's getting harder for him. He wants to spend more time with his grandchildren." Sarah could understand Pedro's decision, but she wondered how Jake managed the workload even with help. Running a ranch this size was a full-time job for several people, not a two-person operation. "What about during calving season? Or roundup?" "I hire temporary help when I need it. But most of the time, it's just us." Jake dismounted to adjust the float valve on the water tank. "This country's hard on small operations. A lot of ranchers have sold out to the big corporations or developers." Sarah watched him work, noting the efficient way he handled the equipment and the gentle attention he paid to details. Everything about Jake Coleman suggested competence and integrity, qualities that were becoming rare in her experience. When they returned to the barn for lunch, Jake introduced her to Pedro Valdez, a compact man with weathered features and kind eyes. Pedro spoke English with a slight accent, but his knowledge of cattle and horses was immediately apparent. "Miss Sarah knows her way around horses," Jake told Pedro as they unsaddled. "Rosie didn't give her any trouble." Pedro smiled at Sarah. "Rosie, she's a good judge of people. If she likes you, you must be okay." The simple acceptance in Pedro's voice meant more to Sarah than she wanted to admit. She'd been questioned and doubted so many times that genuine approval felt foreign. After lunch, Jake tested her cattle working skills. They rode out to a pasture where a small group of steers had clustered near the fence line, and Jake asked her to separate out 3 specific animals and move them to an adjoining field. Sarah had always been good with cattle, and Rosie proved to be an excellent cutting horse. Working together, they separated the 3 steers and guided them through the gate with minimal fuss. The work felt natural, like coming home after a long journey. "Nice work," Jake said when they'd finished. "You read cattle well, and you trust your horse. A lot of people try to micromanage instead of letting the horse do her job." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to relax. Jake tested her on fence repair, equipment maintenance, and basic veterinary care for cattle. She was able to demonstrate competence in all areas, and Jake's questions became more conversational and less like an examination. By late afternoon, they were working together to move a small herd to fresh pasture, and Sarah felt like she was part of a team rather than an applicant being evaluated. Jake's leadership style was quiet but effective. He gave clear directions when necessary but trusted her to handle her responsibilities independently. When they returned to the barn as the sun was setting, Sarah was tired but satisfied. She'd done good work, and she could tell Jake had noticed. Pedro had already left for the day, but Jake helped her unsaddle and care for Rosie. "Well, Miss Martinez," Jake said as they walked toward the trucks, "you can definitely do the work. Question is whether you want to." Sarah's heart leaped. "Are you offering me the job?" "I'm offering you a trial period. 30 days at $800 a week, plus the cabin and utilities. If it works out, we'll talk about making it permanent with a raise. Jake leaned against his truck, studying her face. It's honest work, but it's not easy. Long hours, physical demands, and, like I mentioned yesterday, you'd be living on the ranch. Some folks might have opinions about that. $800 a week was more money than Sarah had made in months. Combined with free housing, it would let her rebuild her savings and, maybe even start planning for the future. When would you want me to start? Monday. That gives you the weekend to settle your affairs in El Paso and move your things. Jake handed her a key attached to a simple keychain. The cabin's about a quarter mile past the main house. It's small but comfortable, and it's yours as long as you work here. Sarah took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. Mr. Coleman, I want you to know how much I appreciate this opportunity. I won't let you down. See that you don't, Jake said, but his tone was warm. And, Miss Martinez? It's a working ranch, not a finishing school. Call me Jake. The drive back to El Paso passed in a blur of excitement and planning. Sarah had 3 days to pack her belongings, close out her apartment lease, and prepare for a new chapter in her life. For the first time in months, she felt like she had a real future ahead of her. But, as she merged onto the highway, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that working for Jake Coleman was going to be more complicated than simple ranch work. There had been moments during the day when she'd caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not romantic interest, exactly, but something deeper than professional evaluation. Sarah had learned not to trust her instincts about men, especially men who held her financial security in their hands. Jake had been nothing but professional and respectful, and she intended to maintain those boundaries no matter how attractive she found his quiet strength and competence. This job was her chance to build something for herself, and she wouldn't risk it by misreading signals or letting personal feelings complicate a good professional arrangement. Jake Coleman was her employer, nothing more. Even as she told herself that, Sarah couldn't forget the way her pulse had quickened every time Jake smiled at her, or the unexpected flutter she'd felt when his hand had briefly touched hers while they were working on the fence. Working for a man like Jake Coleman was going to test her professionalism in ways she hadn't anticipated. But Sarah was determined to prove herself worthy of his trust, whatever the personal cost. The Broken Arrow Ranch was her future now, and she intended to make the most of it. Monday morning arrived with a crisp October chill that made Sarah's breath visible as she loaded the last of her possessions into her pickup truck. She'd managed to break her apartment lease with only a small penalty, and her landlord had even helped her load her furniture. Everything she owned fit into the truck bed and back seat, a sobering reminder of how little she'd accumulated in 26 years. The drive to the Broken Arrow felt different this time. Instead of nervous anticipation, Sarah felt a quiet excitement about starting fresh. The sunrise painted the countryside in shades of gold and amber, and the familiar landscape looked like a promise rather than a reminder of past disappointments. Jake was waiting for her at the main house when she arrived, holding a steaming cup of coffee and looking like he'd been up for hours. His greeting was professional but warm, and Sarah noticed he'd taken the time to clear a path from the main road to the cabin for her truck. "Morning, Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Ready to see your new home?" The cabin was better than Sarah had dared to hope. Nestled in a grove of oak trees about a quarter mile from the main house, it was a compact but well-designed structure with a covered porch and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Inside, she found a comfortable living area, a small but functional kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom with both a shower and a deep soaking tub. Pedro's wife Maria furnished it when he first started working here, Jake explained as Sarah examined the cozy interior. "She's got good taste, and everything's practical. Kitchen's stocked with basics, and there's a washer and dryer in the utility closet." The furniture was simple but comfortable, a leather sofa, wooden dining table, and a bed with a sturdy oak frame. Sarah especially loved the kitchen, which had enough counter space for cooking and a window that looked out toward the pastures. After months of cramped apartment living, the cabin felt luxurious. "It's perfect," Sarah said, meaning it. "Thank you for trusting me with it." Jake studied her face, seeming to recognize her genuine appreciation. "It's yours as long as you want it. Pedro's got his own place in town now, but he lived here for 12 years and took good care of it. I expect you'll do the same." They spent the morning moving Sarah's belongings into the cabin. Jake insisted on helping with the heavy items, and Sarah was grateful for his strength when it came to her dresser and bookshelf. Working together felt natural, and she noticed how efficiently they moved around each other in the small space. "You read a lot," Jake observed, noting the number of books she unpacked. "Ranch work doesn't leave much time for television," Sarah said, arranging her books on the shelf. "And I like learning new things. Some of these are about cattle breeding, others are business management. Never know when you might need information." Jake picked up one of her cattle breeding books and flipped through it, raising an eyebrow at the detailed notes in the margins. "You really do know this business. My daddy always said knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away from you. He made sure I understood the science behind ranching, not just the practical work." "Smart man," Jake said quietly. "I'm sorry you lost him so young." Sarah felt the familiar pang of grief, but it was softer now than it had been in years. "He would have liked seeing me here. He always said I belonged on a ranch, not stuck in some city apartment." By afternoon, Sarah was settled enough to start her first official day of work. Pedro met them at the barn and explained the daily routine: morning chores, pasture checks, equipment maintenance, and whatever special projects needed attention. The schedule was demanding but logical, designed to make the most of daylight hours and seasonal requirements. "Miss Sarah," Pedro said as they prepared to ride out for afternoon cattle checks, "Jake, he's a good boss. Fair but demanding. He expects the best, but he'll teach you everything you need to know." Sarah appreciated Pedro's guidance, but she could already see that Jake was the kind of leader she'd always hoped to work for. He gave clear instructions, trusted his people to handle their responsibilities, and led by example rather than just giving orders. The first week passed quickly as Sarah adjusted to the ranch routine. She was up before dawn for morning chores, spent most days in the saddle checking cattle and maintaining facilities, and usually finished work around sunset. It was physically demanding, but Sarah felt stronger and more energetic than she had in months. Jake gradually increased her responsibilities as he saw her competence. By Friday, she was handling the morning cattle checks independently while Jake focused on equipment repair and business matters. Pedro worked alongside both of them, sharing his encyclopedic knowledge of the ranch's history and the individual animals in their care. "That big red cow over there," Pedro told Sarah as they checked the breeding herd, "she's Mama Rosa. 15 years old, and she's raised some of the best calves on the ranch. Jake, he could sell her for beef, but he keeps her because she's earned retirement." Sarah liked learning these stories. Jake clearly cared about his animals as individuals, not just assets. It was the kind of ranching philosophy her father had taught her, that good stewardship meant taking care of everything in your charge, from the land to the livestock to the people who worked with you. Jake's management style impressed her more each day. He worked harder than anyone, often taking the most dangerous or difficult jobs himself. But he also trusted his employees to make decisions within their areas of expertise, and he never micromanaged or second-guessed their choices. "You settling in okay?" Jake asked Friday evening as they finished the daily equipment check. "Better than okay," Sarah said honestly. "I feel like I'm actually contributing here, not just trying to prove I belong." Jake nodded approvingly. "Pedro says you're picking up our routine faster than anyone he's trained." That's high praise from him. Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Pedro's respect meant a lot to her, and knowing she'd earned it made the long days feel worthwhile. The weekend brought different challenges. Pedro took Saturdays off to spend with his family, leaving Sarah and Jake to handle the essential chores together. Saturday morning started with a crisis. One of the pregnant cows was having trouble calving, and they needed to assist the birth. "You ever deliver a calf?" Jake asked as they approached the cow, who was lying on her side in obvious distress. "Several times," Sarah said, already assessing the situation. "Looks like a breech presentation." Jake nodded grimly. "We'll need to turn the calf." Can you handle the cow's head while I work? The next hour was intense and messy work, but they managed to deliver a healthy calf and save the cow. Sarah's small hands were actually an advantage in the delicate process of repositioning the baby, and Jake acknowledged her skill with genuine respect. Good work, he said as they watched the calf take its first steps. A lot of people would have panicked in that situation. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction watching the mother cow nuzzle her newborn. This was why she'd chosen ranch life, the privilege of working with animals, helping with the fundamental processes of life and growth. That evening, Jake invited her to the main house for dinner. Sarah hesitated, unsure about the propriety of socializing with her boss, but Jake's manner was casual and friendly rather than romantic. I always cook extra on weekends, he explained. Seems foolish to eat alone when you're right down the road. Besides, you've earned a decent meal after the day we've had. Jake's house was comfortable and masculine, with leather furniture, Western art, and a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, clearly designed by someone who enjoyed cooking. Sarah was impressed by the bookshelves that lined one wall. Jake's collection included ranching texts, business books, and classic literature. You read Steinbeck? Sarah asked, noting several worn paperbacks. East of Eden is one of my favorites, Jake said, surprising her. People assume ranchers don't read anything but cattle journals, but some of us went to college. Where did you study? Texas A&M, agricultural business with a minor in animal science. My father wanted me to get a degree before I took over the ranch. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. He died my senior year, so I never got to show him what I learned. Sometimes I wonder if he'd approve of how I've run things. Sarah heard the note of uncertainty in his voice and felt an unexpected urge to comfort him. From what I can see, you've built something impressive here. The land's healthy, the cattle are thriving, and you run the business professionally. Any father would be proud. Jake looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such insight from an employee he'd known for only a week. Thank you. That means more than you know. Dinner was excellent: grilled steaks, roasted vegetables, and homemade bread that Jake claimed was his one domestic talent. They talked about ranching, books, and their shared love of the outdoors. Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected, enjoying Jake's quiet humor and obvious intelligence. You said you tried other work before coming here, Jake said over coffee. What kind? Sarah felt her cheeks warm. She'd been dreading this conversation, but Jake deserved honesty. I worked for a companion service in Dallas for a few months. Escort work, but legitimate, accompanying men to business functions and social events. She braced herself for judgment or disapproval, but Jake's expression remained neutral. Didn't work out? I wasn't what most clients wanted. They preferred women who could make a dramatic impression, and I'm not exactly the glamorous type. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze. I needed money, and it seemed like a way to earn decent wages quickly. But I was never comfortable with it. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah began to regret her honesty. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than critical. Takes courage to try something outside your comfort zone when you're desperate. And more courage to walk away when it doesn't fit. He refilled her coffee cup. For what it's worth, I think those clients were idiots. Real elegance doesn't come from height or glamour. Sarah felt an unexpected rush of gratitude. Jake's acceptance meant more to her than she wanted to admit, especially since she'd been judging herself harshly for the escort work. Thank you, she said quietly. That's kind of you to say. It's honest, not kind, Jake corrected. I don't believe in false flattery. As the evening wound down, Sarah helped Jake clean the kitchen, falling into an easy domestic rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She found herself stealing glances at him as he worked, noting the way his sleeves were rolled up over strong forearms and the comfortable way he moved around his own space. I should head back to the cabin, Sarah said when the last dish was dried. Early morning tomorrow. Sunday's usually quieter, Jake said, walking her to the door. But we'll need to check on that cow and calf, make sure they're both doing well. Standing on Jake's front porch, Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to leave. The evening had been more enjoyable than any social interaction she'd had in months, and Jake's company was both stimulating and comfortable. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "And for trusting me with the difficult calving today." "Thank you for proving my instincts were right," Jake replied. "Sleep well, Sarah." The quarter-mile walk back to her cabin gave Sarah time to think about the evening. Jake Coleman was turning out to be more complex and interesting than she'd initially realized. He was clearly well-educated, thoughtful, and surprisingly good company. The fact that he'd accepted her honesty about the escort work without judgment spoke to his character. But Sarah reminded herself that Jake was her employer, and getting personally involved with him would be a mistake that could cost her the best job she'd ever had. She needed to maintain professional boundaries, no matter how attractive she found his intelligence and quiet strength. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Sarah threw herself into ranch work with enthusiasm, taking on additional responsibilities as Jake's confidence in her abilities grew. She began handling some of the business correspondence, helped with breeding decisions, and even took over the monthly cattle inventory. Pedro announced his official retirement plans. He'd work through the busy fall season, then step back to part-time status by Christmas. The news meant Sarah would soon be Jake's primary partner in running the ranch, a prospect that both excited and intimidated her. "You ready for that kind of responsibility?" Jake asked after Pedro shared his timeline. "I think so," Sarah said honestly. "There's still a lot I need to learn, but I'm willing to work at it." Pedro's offered to stay on as needed for training and busy seasons. "Between the two of us, we should be able to teach you everything you need to know." The prospect of working so closely with Jake made Sarah's pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with professional excitement. Over the past month, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet competence and dry humor. Jake was unlike any man she'd ever known, strong without being dominating, intelligent without being condescending, and genuinely interested in her opinions and ideas. But Jake had never given any indication that he saw her as anything more than a valued employee. His manner remained consistently professional, even during their occasional shared meals or evening conversations. Sarah told herself this was for the best, but she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt. The situation became more complicated when Helena Ashworth called unexpectedly on a Tuesday evening. "Sarah, darling, I hope you're well," Helena's cultured voice came through Sarah's phone. "I have an unusual opportunity that might interest you." Sarah stepped onto her cabin's porch, not wanting Jake to overhear if he happened to be nearby. "Hello, Helena. I'm actually working at a ranch now, so I'm not available for companion services." "This isn't my usual arrangement," Helena said quickly. "I have a client who specifically requested you. He saw your photograph in my portfolio and was quite taken with your natural, understated elegance." Sarah frowned. Only a few clients had ever seen her photo, and none had shown particular interest. "Who is it?" "Richard Hawthorne. He's a cattle broker from Fort Worth, very successful and well-connected. He needs a companion for his family's annual charity gala next month. It's a significant event, politicians, business leaders, society types. The compensation would be exceptional." The name Richard Hawthorne was familiar to Sarah from cattle industry publications. He was indeed successful, with connections throughout Texas ranching circles. But something about Helena's tone made her suspicious. "Why did he specifically request me?" "Most of your clients prefer the more glamorous women." Helena hesitated slightly. "Richard has an appreciation for authenticity. He specifically said he wanted someone who understands cattle ranching and can hold intelligent conversations about the industry. Your background makes you perfect for his needs." Sarah considered the offer. The money would be substantial, probably more than she made in 2 months at the ranch. And it was only one evening, not a return to the companion service full-time. "How much?" Sarah asked. $5,000 for the evening, plus expenses. Richard is quite generous with compensation. $5,000 would allow Sarah to pay off her remaining debts and start building serious savings. It was more money than she'd ever made in a single day, and for work that was entirely legitimate. "I'll need to check with my employer about taking the evening off," Sarah said slowly. "Of course. The gala is November 15th, a Saturday evening. Let me know by Friday if you're interested." After Helena hung up, Sarah sat on her porch swing, trying to decide what to do. The money was incredible, and one evening away wouldn't affect her ranch responsibilities significantly. But she worried about how Jake would react to learning about her past escort work and her consideration of returning to it, even briefly. Sarah had been completely honest with Jake about her background, and he'd been accepting. But asking for time off to work as a paid companion might test that acceptance. She didn't want to risk damaging their professional relationship or his respect for her. On the other hand, Sarah had worked hard to rebuild her financial stability, and this opportunity could accelerate that process significantly. $5,000 would give her the security she'd been seeking and the freedom to plan for her future without constantly worrying about money. The next morning, Sarah decided to be direct with Jake about the situation. He was in his office reviewing breeding records when she knocked on the main house door. "Come in," Jake called. "What's on your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I received an offer yesterday for some work outside the ranch. It would only require one evening, but I wanted to discuss it with you before making any decisions." Jake leaned back in his chair, giving her his full attention. "What kind of work?" "Companion services. A businessman needs an escort for a charity gala in Fort Worth. The compensation is substantial, and it's completely legitimate." Jake's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something: disappointment? Concern? In his dark eyes. "How substantial?" $5,000 for one evening." Jake whistled softly. "That's serious money. When is it?" "November 15th, a Saturday. I'd leave after work that day and be back Sunday morning." Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider multiple aspects of the situation. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "That's your decision, Sarah. You're a free agent, and what you do on your own time is your business. But I have to ask, is this about the money, or are you having second thoughts about ranch work?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "It's about the money. This job has been the best thing that's happened to me in years, and I have no intention of leaving. But $5,000 would change my financial situation completely. It would give me the security to really commit to building a future here." Jake nodded slowly. "I understand. Financial security is important, especially when you've been struggling." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The escort business attracts some questionable people, even the legitimate side of it." "I promise," Sarah said, grateful for his concern rather than judgment. "Helena Ashworth runs a professional operation, and this particular client has an excellent reputation." "All right then. Take the evening off, make your money, and come back ready to work." "But, Sarah?" Jake's voice carried a note of something that might have been possessiveness. "Remember that your real life is here now." Sarah felt an unexpected flutter at his words, but she told herself not to read too much into them. Jake was being protective of a valued employee, nothing more. That evening, she called Helena to accept the assignment. As she hung up the phone, Sarah told herself she was making a smart financial decision. One evening of companion work would secure her future and allow her to focus entirely on her ranch career. But, as she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was taking a risk that went beyond simple business. The way Jake had looked at her when she mentioned the escort work suggested that her decision mattered to him on a level deeper than professional interest. Sarah pushed the thought away. Jake Coleman was her boss and nothing more, regardless of her growing feelings for him. Making $5,000 in one evening was a practical opportunity she couldn't afford to pass up, no matter what complications it might create in her personal life. The November gala was still weeks away, but Sarah already felt like she was walking a tightrope between her past and her future. She just hoped she was skilled enough to reach the other side without falling. The weeks leading up to the Fort Worth Gala passed in a blur of intensified ranch work and growing tension. Sarah threw herself into her responsibilities with renewed dedication, partly to prove her commitment to Jake and, partly to distract herself from the complicated emotions the upcoming assignment stirred up. Jake's behavior remained professionally cordial, but Sarah sensed a subtle shift in their interactions. Their easy dinner conversations became less frequent, and, when they did talk, she felt an undercurrent of something unspoken. He never mentioned the escort work again, but Sarah caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't decipher. Pedro's retirement preparations created additional pressure. He spent long days training Sarah on the ranch's financial systems, breeding programs, and seasonal routines. The sheer volume of knowledge was overwhelming, but Sarah was determined to master every detail. "Miss Sarah," Pedro said one afternoon as they reviewed cattle breeding records, "you are learning very fast. But I think maybe you worry too much about being perfect." "I need to be ready when you retire," Sarah replied, checking another entry against the physical records. "Jake's trusting me with a lot of responsibility." Pedro studied her with wise eyes. "Jake, he trusts you already. The question is, do you trust yourself?" Before Sarah could answer, Jake appeared in the barn doorway. "How's the training going?" "Miss Sarah, she knows more than she thinks she does," Pedro said diplomatically. "Maybe it's time for her to handle the breeding decisions for the spring calving." Jake raised an eyebrow. That level of responsibility typically took years to earn, but Pedro's recommendation carried enormous weight. "You feel ready for that?" Jake asked Sarah directly. "I think so," Sarah said, though her heart raced at the prospect. "Pedro's been thorough in his explanations, and I understand the genetics and financial considerations." "All right. We'll start with the November breeding schedule. Pedro can supervise, but the decisions are yours." As Jake walked away, Sarah felt both pride and terror. Managing the breeding program meant making decisions that would affect the ranch's profitability for years to come. It was exactly the kind of challenge she'd always wanted, but the timing felt complicated. The Friday before the gala, Sarah received a package from Helena containing her dress and accessories. The gown was elegant and understated, deep navy silk with a classic cut that flattered her petite figure without being overly revealing. Helena had chosen well, selecting something that would help Sarah blend seamlessly with high society while highlighting her natural grace. That evening, Jake appeared at her cabin door as she was hanging the dress in her closet. "Evening, Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Wanted to check if you needed anything for tomorrow." Sarah invited him in, though she immediately regretted it when his gaze fell on the gown hanging in her bedroom doorway. The sight of the expensive dress seemed to make their conversation more real and immediate. "It's beautiful," Jake said quietly. "You'll look stunning in it." Something in his tone made Sarah's pulse quicken. "Thank you. Helena has good taste." Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sarah, I hope you know that your value here has nothing to do with how you look in an evening gown. You're an exceptional rancher and a trusted partner. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're worth less than that." Sarah felt a rush of emotion at his words. "I won't. This is just business, Jake." One evening, then, back to real life. "Good," Jake said, but his eyes lingered on her face. "Because your real life is here now. At least, I hope it is." After he left, Sarah sat on her sofa, replaying his words and the intensity in his voice. Jake's concern went beyond professional interest, but she still wasn't sure exactly what he was feeling or what he wanted from her. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's mood. She completed her ranch chores mechanically, trying not to think about the evening ahead. Jake was unusually quiet during their morning cattle check, and Pedro seemed to sense the tension between them. "Miss Sarah," Pedro said as they finished the breeding barn inspection, "you remember what's important, yes? Money is good, but some things matter more." Sarah wasn't sure if Pedro was talking about the escort work or something deeper, but his concern was evident. She'd grown fond of the older man's fatherly guidance, and his approval meant a great deal to her. By afternoon, Sarah was ready to leave for Fort Worth. She'd arranged to meet Richard Hawthorne at his hotel, then accompany him to the gala at a downtown venue. Helena had briefed her thoroughly on Hawthorne's background and the evening's expectations. As Sarah loaded her garment bag into her truck, Jake appeared from the barn. "Drive safely," he said simply. "And, Sarah? Remember what Pedro said about knowing what's important." The drive to Fort Worth took 2 hours, giving Sarah time to mentally prepare for the evening ahead. She'd always been good at adapting to different social situations, but it had been months since she'd needed to project the polished sophistication that escort work required. The Hotel Worthington was as elegant as Helena had described, and Sarah felt appropriately dressed in her traveling clothes, a simple black suit that could transition easily to formal wear. Richard Hawthorne met her in the lobby precisely at the appointed time. Hawthorne was in his early 50s, distinguished looking with silver hair and expensive clothes. His manner was courteous but businesslike, treating Sarah with the professional respect she'd hoped for. "Miss Martinez, a pleasure to meet you," Hawthorne said, shaking her hand firmly. "Helena speaks very highly of your knowledge of the cattle industry. That will be invaluable tonight." As they talked over drinks in the hotel bar, Sarah realized why Hawthorne had specifically requested her. The gala was more than a social event, it was a networking opportunity where cattle industry connections would be crucial. Hawthorne needed a companion who could contribute meaningfully to conversations rather than just looking decorative. "Most of the attendees tonight are involved in agriculture or related businesses," Hawthorne explained. "Your ranching background will help me make connections that wouldn't be possible with a typical escort." Sarah appreciated his honesty about the evening's purpose. This was strategic networking disguised as social companionship, which made her feel more comfortable about the arrangement. The gala venue was spectacular, a restored historic mansion with ballrooms that showcased Texas grandeur. Sarah had worried about feeling out of place, but her navy gown and Helena's coaching helped her blend seamlessly with the well-dressed crowd. Hawthorne proved to be an ideal client, introducing Sarah as a ranching expert and encouraging her to share her knowledge during conversations. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, discussing cattle breeding with ranch owners, talking land management with agricultural investors, and even debating market trends with commodity brokers. "You're a natural at this," Hawthorne said during a quiet moment. "Helena mentioned you were new to companion work, but you handle these social situations like you were born to them." Sarah smiled, feeling more confident than she had all week. "I guess ranch work teaches you to adapt to different situations. You never know what challenge you'll face on any given day." The evening progressed smoothly until Sarah noticed a familiar figure across the ballroom. Jake Coleman stood near the bar, dressed in a perfectly fitted tuxedo that transformed his rugged appeal into devastating elegance. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Jake wasn't alone. A striking blonde woman in a red dress stood beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was exactly the type of woman clients usually requested from Helena's service, tall, glamorous, and commanding immediate attention. Sarah tried to focus on her conversation with a group of ranch investors, but her attention kept drifting to Jake and his companion. She'd never seen him in formal wear before, and the transformation was startling. The tuxedo emphasized his broad shoulders and height, while his naturally confident bearing made him look like he belonged among Texas society's elite. "Excuse me," Hawthorne said suddenly, following Sarah's gaze. "I see someone I need to speak with. Would you mind accompanying me?" Before Sarah could object, Hawthorne was guiding her across the ballroom toward Jake and his companion. Sarah's heart raced as they approached, uncertain how to handle this unexpected encounter. "Jake Coleman," Hawthorne called out warmly. "Good to see you here." Jake turned, his expression shifting from polite social interest to surprise when he saw Sarah. His companion looked between them with obvious curiosity. "Richard," Jake replied, shaking Hawthorne's hand. "I didn't know you'd be attending tonight." "Last-minute decision," Hawthorne said smoothly. "Allow me to introduce my companion, Sarah Martinez." Sarah, this is Jake Coleman, one of the finest ranch operators in Texas. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as Jake's gaze met hers. His expression was unreadable, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Miss Martinez, Jake said formally, as if they were strangers. Mr. Coleman, Sarah replied, playing along with the pretense. Jake's companion stepped forward with a practiced smile. I'm Victoria Hammond. How do you know each other? There was a moment of awkward silence before Hawthorne stepped in smoothly. Sarah is quite knowledgeable about cattle ranching. I thought she and Jake might have mutual interests to discuss. Victoria's smile became more calculating. How fascinating. I don't think I've met many women in the cattle business. Sarah felt the subtle dismissal in Victoria's tone but maintained her composure. It's becoming more common. Many successful operations benefit from diverse perspectives. I'm sure they do, Victoria said with barely concealed condescension. Though I imagine the work must be quite challenging for someone of your stature. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. Sarah felt a flash of anger at both Victoria's rudeness and Jake's failure to defend her. Physical strength matters less than knowledge and dedication, Sarah said evenly. Most of the real work in ranching involves decision-making rather than physical labor. Hawthorne seemed to sense the underlying tension and smoothly changed the subject to market conditions. But Sarah could feel Jake's eyes on her throughout the conversation, and she struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. When the group finally separated, Sarah excused herself to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect herself. Seeing Jake with another woman shouldn't have affected her so strongly, but the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Victoria was exactly the type of woman Sarah had always assumed Jake would prefer: sophisticated, glamorous, and obviously comfortable in high society settings. Compared to Victoria's polished elegance, Sarah felt like exactly what she was, a small-town ranch worker playing dress-up for the evening. When Sarah returned to the ballroom, she threw herself into her role with renewed determination. She charmed investors, impressed ranch owners with her knowledge, and helped Hawthorne make several valuable connections. If Jake was watching, she wanted him to see her at her professional best. The evening's climax came during the charity auction, where Sarah found herself bidding on behalf of Hawthorne for a week-long hunting trip to a prestigious ranch. Her knowledge of the property and its reputation helped Hawthorne secure the package at a reasonable price, earning his visible appreciation. Outstanding work tonight, Hawthorne said as the formal program concluded. You've more than earned your fee. Would you be interested in similar arrangements in the future? Sarah considered the offer. The evening had been financially successful and personally satisfying in many ways. But seeing Jake with Victoria had crystallized something she'd been trying to ignore. Her feelings for him went far deeper than professional respect. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said carefully, but I think this will be my last assignment. My ranch work requires my full attention. Hawthorne nodded understandingly. Helena mentioned you might feel that way. Well, if you ever change your mind, you have my contact information. As they prepared to leave, Jake appeared beside their table. Victoria was nowhere in sight, and his expression was carefully controlled. Richard, Sarah, he said formally. Enjoyed seeing you both tonight. Likewise, Hawthorne replied. Sarah was just telling me about her ranch work. You're lucky to have someone with her expertise. Jake's gaze met Sarah's briefly. Yes, I am. The simple words carried layers of meaning that made Sarah's pulse quicken, but Jake's tone remained professionally neutral. Well, we should be going, Hawthorne said, gathering his things. Early morning tomorrow. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah couldn't resist one glance back. Jake was standing where they'd left him, watching her leave with an expression that looked almost like regret. The drive back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. Sarah had successfully completed her assignment and earned more money than she'd ever made in a single evening. But, instead of feeling triumphant, she felt oddly empty. Seeing Jake with Victoria had forced her to confront the depth of her feelings and the impossibility of acting on them. Jake was clearly capable of attracting sophisticated, glamorous women who matched his success and social standing. Sarah might be a valued employee, but she was fooling herself if she thought she could be anything more. It was nearly midnight when Sarah reached the Broken Arrow Ranch. The main house was dark, but she saw Jake's truck parked in its usual spot. As she pulled up to her cabin, her headlights caught a figure sitting on her front porch. Jake rose as she parked, still wearing his tuxedo trousers and dress shirt, though he'd removed the jacket and tie. In the moonlight, he looked even more imposing than usual. "How did it go?" he asked as Sarah gathered her things from the truck. "Very well," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Hawthorne was pleased with the evening. Jake followed her to the porch, maintaining a careful distance. "Good. That's what matters." Sarah unlocked her door, then turned to face him. Victoria seemed lovely. "Is she from the cattle industry too?" "Victoria's a friend from college. Her family owns land near Austin." Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "She needed an escort for the evening, and I owed her a favor." Sarah felt a ridiculous surge of relief that Victoria wasn't Jake's romantic interest, then immediately chastised herself for caring. It didn't matter who Jake dated, he was her employer, and she needed to maintain professional boundaries. "Well, I should let you get some rest," Sarah said, reaching for her door handle. "Sarah, wait." Jake's voice stopped her. "There's something I need to say." Sarah turned back to him, her heart racing at the intensity in his voice. "Seeing you tonight, watching you work that room like you belonged there, it reminded me of something I've been trying to ignore." Jake stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell his cologne and see the conflict in his dark eyes. "What's that?" Sarah whispered. "That you're extraordinary. Not just as a rancher, though you're exceptional at that. But, as a woman. You're intelligent, capable, beautiful, and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. Including yourself." Sarah's breath caught as Jake reached up to cup her face gently. "I know this complicates things," Jake continued, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I know I'm your employer and this could change everything between us. But, watching you walk away tonight, knowing another man was paying for your company, I couldn't stand it." "Jake," Sarah breathed, leaning into his touch despite herself. "I don't want you to work as an escort anymore," Jake said quietly. "Not because I disapprove, but because I'm selfish enough to want you here, with me, where you belong." Before Sarah could respond, Jake leaned down and kissed her softly, tentatively, as if giving her the chance to pull away. But Sarah had been dreaming of this moment for weeks, and she melted into his embrace instead. The kiss deepened as months of suppressed attraction finally found expression. Jake's arms came around her, pulling her against his chest, and Sarah felt like she was finally coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This changes everything," Sarah said, voicing what they were both thinking. "Only if we let it," Jake replied. "We're both adults, and we're partners in this ranch regardless of what happens between us personally. The question is whether you're willing to take the risk." Sarah looked up at this man who had given her a chance when no one else would, who had seen her potential when others saw only limitations, who had just revealed feelings that matched her own growing emotions. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm willing to take the risk." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "Good. Because I've been falling for you since the day you stood up to me outside Murphy's store." Sarah laughed, remembering her desperation that day and how far she'd come. "I thought you were just being kind to a down-on-her-luck ranch hand." "I was investing in the future," Jake corrected, pulling her closer. "Our future." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the pasture behind the main house, watching Jake work with a young colt. The spring roundup was complete, the calving season had been successful, and the ranch was thriving under their joint management. Pedro had settled into comfortable semi-retirement, helping out during busy seasons but spending most of his time with his growing family. Sarah had more than fulfilled his confidence in her abilities, making breeding decisions that had improved the herd's quality and implementing cost-saving measures that boosted profitability. But, more importantly, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a true partnership with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. "You know," Jake said, joining her at the fence after releasing the colt. "I've been thinking about making some changes around here." "What kind of changes?" Sarah asked, leaning into his embrace. "Well, Pedro's cabin is sitting empty, and this ranch is getting successful enough to support a family." Jake's arms tightened around her. "I was wondering if you might be interested in making this partnership permanent." Sarah turned in his arms, her heart racing at the implication in his words. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Coleman?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me," Jake said, his voice warm with emotion. "To be my partner in everything, the ranch, a family, whatever the future brings." "What do you say, Sarah Martinez?" Sarah looked around at the ranch that had become her home, the land they'd worked together to improve, the life they'd built side by side. A year ago, she'd been a desperate woman taking any work she could find. Now she was half owner of a successful operation, engaged to a man who cherished her exactly as she was. "I say yes," Sarah said, standing on her toes to kiss the man who had seen her worth when no one else would. "To all of it." As Jake spun her around in the late afternoon sunlight, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her here. She'd started as a bride for hire, overlooked for her size and dismissed for her appearance. But Jake Coleman had seen past the surface to recognize her true value, crafting not just a ranch for her to work but a future for them to share. Sometimes the best things came in small packages, and sometimes the most unlikely partnerships created the strongest foundations. Sarah had learned that her worth had never been measured by her height or her glamour, but by her heart, her mind, and her willingness to work for the life she wanted. Standing in Jake's arms on the land they now owned together, Sarah knew she had finally found where she belonged.